Florida History and Genealogy Library at the John F. Germany Library. And we are going to start off with shouting out some of our local societies, genealogical societies, and we're going to start with the South Bay. It's a South Bay Genealogical Society, and they are an independent organization, and they're recognized. They're assisting its members in pursuit of family history. They hold a monthly luncheon meeting featuring outstanding speakers and a genealogy roundtable discussion, and they sponsor a genealogy technology forum on the first Monday of the month. They publish a newsletter links that contains a wealth of information about the society and genealogy in general, and they publish a monthly SBGS genealogy bulletin with news events of the wider genealogy community. Next society is the Pinellas Genealogical Society, and they host meetings open to the public every third Saturday of the month at 11 a.m. For more information, you can visit their website at pinellasgenealogysociety.com. And now we'll introduce our speaker, who is Marcia Jo Zerivitz, and she's presenting on Jews of Florida, Centuries of Stories. Florida has the third largest population in the nation and hosts the third largest Jewish community, whose history is very surprising. Marcia will present on a PowerPoint book talk highlighting some stories of 100 photos from Jews of Florida, Centuries of Stories, and focusing on Jewish history of Tampa, its first Jewish settler in 1844. And she is also she's a director of the Jewish Museum of Florida and has been a leader in the Florida Jewish community for more than half a century. And she is originally from West Virginia. She's immersed herself in everything Jewish throughout her life and has broken the glass ceiling as the first woman in many positions. And in 2016, she was awarded a Doctor of Humane Letters from Florida International University, and has been in leadership positions throughout her life and expanded the knowledge and enriched the collective historic memory. And her scholarship has been used in exhibitions, films, TV documentaries, historical journals, books, and published nationally and internationally.
All right, we're going to give Marcia control here so she can share her wonderful slides with us. Perfect.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to the Tampa Heritage Festival presentation about the Jews of Tampa. In the next 50 minutes, I will give you a very brief overview of Florida Jewish history, then focus on Tampa and tell you some stories about Jews who have contributed to the development of your community since 1844. But first, who are the Jews? Jews are a people, a family of less than 1/4% of the world's population. A family is defined as having a common ancestor. The Jewish family descended from Sarah and Abraham about 4,000 years ago. As a result of exiles and expulsions, most Jews became a migratory people for 1,800 years until the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948. One is born into the family or adopted through conversion. Like any family, there are rules to follow, some perhaps more than 3,000 years old. Through all the migrations, Jews have carried their traditions and passed them down through the generations, all the way to Florida more than 250 years ago. The word history contains the word story. Jews are storytellers. Little had been revealed about Florida Jewish history until 1984, when I got involved in the Mosaic Project to research this history. From where I lived in Orlando, I spent the next 8 years on the road, traveling 250,000 miles around Florida to set up and manage task forces, all volunteers, for the grassroots research in 30 communities, to collect oral histories, photographs, documents, and artifacts that flesh out this story. I had a very active group in Tampa. I get asked all the time, how do you know what you now know? I now know that history is people, people who effect change, who make the world a better place, people who inspire us. By 1984, no one had researched or documented the Florida Jewish history. Being a product of the 1940s and 50s public schools, when I began the research in the 1980s, my inclination was to go to the public library. But there were absolutely no books on this subject. And this was before Google and Wikipedia, if you can imagine that. Hundreds of people were involved. I did my best to validate the stories of the memories of the people we were collecting. An important part of the process was to create a database of all that we were discovering. New technology at that time, a step up from the legal pad, so I could sort and find people. One example, it's 1986, before cell phones, Google, and Wikipedia. I'm in Jacksonville interviewing Rosalie and Robert Coleman about his grandfather, George Delinsky, shown in this photograph. In 1857, you heard me right, 1857, George was the first boy born in Florida to a Jewish family that planted roots in the state and has lived here continuously as Jews since 1850. I ask if they have any of George's personal possessions. Rosalie chimes in, I have his pocket watch with Hebrew numerals that he carried his entire life. It's in the safety deposit box at the bank, and no one in the family even knows that I have it. Would you like to see it? I say, absolutely. And at the bank, I ask if our Mosaic Jewish Life in Florida project could borrow it for the traveling exhibit. She says yes. And then in 1995, when we created the Jewish Museum of Florida on Miami Beach, I asked if she would donate it to the collections. She said yes. I want to emphasize that this is how the material evidence and collective historic memories of more than 250 years of Jewish life in Florida were retrieved, piece by piece. The family continues to live in Jacksonville and has descendants in Florida that number 75 into the 9th generation. The Delinsky family shows up around Florida and also in Tampa. The research findings resulted in the Mosaic traveling exhibit that opened in 1990 and traveled to 13 cities over 4 years, from 1990 to 1994. It was in Tampa at the Scarfone Gallery at the University of Tampa in 1992. In 1995, Mosaic evolved into the Jewish Museum of Florida on South Beach, a permanent home for the collections and a place to present exhibits and public programs, to tell the stories of one ethnic group in a hugely diverse state. We were at first in the 1936 historic synagogue on the right, and then expanded into the 1929 synagogue following adaptive reuse restorations. Florida has the third largest Jewish community in the nation, with more than 22 million people. That includes about 760,000 Jews, or about 3.4% of the population. To compare that with New York, they have about 8.9% of the population that's Jewish, and California has about 5% of the population that are Jewish. Most scholars thought Florida Jewish history began post-World War II on Miami Beach. For 4 decades, I have asked a lot of questions. The answers and material evidence we assembled resulted in a huge story. Most are not aware that Jews could not live in Florida at all for 250 years after Florida was discovered in 1513. That is when Ponce de Leon first reached Florida's coast, probably between today's Daytona Beach and Melbourne, found the natives hostile, and named the new land La Florida after Pascua Florida, which means the Feast of Flowers, because it was Easter time. On his second voyage in 1521, he arrived in Tampa Bay. Because this was during the Inquisition, which lasted from 1478 to 1834, and Ponce de Leon sailed for Spain, which then owned Florida, only Catholics could live here for the next 250 years, until 1763. That is when the Treaty of Paris was signed in Paris, France, following the 7 years or French and Indian War, which was the final phase of the century-long Anglo-French struggle for commercial supremacy. In this treaty, Spain ceded Florida to Britain, and people other than Catholics could finally settle here, including Jews. These are the 1765 Pensacola Council minutes that reflect the names of 3 Jews who arrived in 1763. They bought property and stores and did business with the British and others, selling wood and other goods. We've been taught that the first Jews arrived in America in 1654 in New Amsterdam that became New York. In the early 1980s, when I began research, it was my hypothesis that it was very possible that Florida Jewish history started in St. Augustine with conversos. Conversos are Jews who converted to Catholicism during the Inquisition in Spain or Portugal to save their lives. If this presence could be documented, it would rewrite all of American Jewish history that it started in Florida and not in New York. Historians note that there are Spanish Jewish names on the list of soldiers and settlers in St. Augustine in 1565. The St. Augustine Jewish Historical Society was organized to unearth some interesting facts. For example, the chief harbor pilot in 1577 and 78 was a converso Jew, Antonio Martinez Carvajal. The history between 1492 and 1654 needs to be rewritten to include a chapter in Florida in the 16th century. We do know that 200 years ago, 26 years before Florida's 1845 statehood, one Jew saw development opportunities. In 1820, a year before Florida became a United States territory, Moroccan Jew Moses Levy began purchasing 100,000 acres that spread from around Gainesville, south to Florida, and west to Tampa Bay. Levy formed the Florida Association, which was the first development corporation in Florida. He was the most important person in early Florida Jewish history. He built a 1,000-acre pilgrimage plantation near Gainesville. No photo exists of Levy, only this house drawing based on his writings. Pilgrimage was a fully functioning plantation that lasted from 1822 to 1835. Its main commodity was sugarcane, which Levy had reintroduced to Florida. It was intended as a refuge for oppressed European Jews to become farmers in a communitarian settlement, the first on U.S. soil. Felix Warburg of the famous German banking family was his recruiting agent in Europe. At least 5 German Jewish families lived there, including Warburg. As a matter of fact, if anyone is on the screen from University of Florida, Lake Warburg is named for him. Moses Levy was Florida's first education commissioner, an advocate of public schools, and instrumental in establishing Florida's first free public school in St. Augustine. He was a vigorous advocate for the gradual abolition of slavery and the humane treatment of enslaved people. Moses Levy was the father of David Levy Yulee, the first U.S. Senator from Florida and the first U.S. Senator of Jewish heritage in American history. There have been only 2 Jewish senators from Florida. The second was Richard Stone from 1975 to 1980. David moved to Pilgrimage Plantation at the age of 17 to help his father, and he lived there for 4 years. Then he wanted to become a lawyer, and there were no law schools at that time, so he moved to Tallahassee and apprenticed with a lawyer and was admitted to the bar in 1836 and got involved in politics. Florida became the 27th state in 1845 with the leadership of David Levy Yulee. He helped draft Florida's Constitution and worked hard for statehood when there were about 60,000 people in Florida that included about 100 Jews. He was referred to as that alien Jew delegate from Florida, even though he had gone through citizenship proceedings twice. He served as a senator until secession of Florida from the Union and served in a Union prison for 1 year. Yulee was the family's ancestral name from Morocco, a name he added to Levy when he went to Washington. David Levy Yulee was important both in politics and the economy. In 1861, he formed Florida Railroad Company, the first cross-state railroad, so goods arriving from Europe could be transported across the state instead of the very long and expensive trip around Key West and up the West Coast. The railroad operated for 80 years. The town of Yulee near Jacksonville and the Yulee Sugar Mill at Homosassa are among the places in Florida named for him. During World War II, there was a U.S. Liberty ship named for him. Moses Levy's plantation was destroyed at the start of the Second Seminole War in 1835. And then we meet Abraham Myers, for whom the city of Fort Myers is named. In 1833, he graduated from West Point. During the Second Seminole War, Myers engaged in battle with the Seminole Indians. In 1849, Myers was made chief quartermaster of the Department of Florida and was stationed at Fort Brooke, which became Tampa, with General David Twiggs, who became Myers' future father-in-law. In 1850, General Twiggs ordered a new fort to be built in Southwest Florida on the Colusa River with the designation of Fort Myers. Colonel Myers remained in the Army until 1861 when he resigned to join the Confederacy, where he was the first Quartermaster General of the Confederate Army. This old Florida map tells a large story. It reflects the sequence of the earliest documentation of Jewish life in communities around the state. I included photos of Jewish pioneers in each place. I've already spoken about Pensacola, which was 1763. Then we have Micanopy in 1819, Tallahassee in 1837. It had become the capital in 1824. Then we have Key West in the 1840s and Jacksonville. People could come into the ports of Key West and Jacksonville long before there was an Ellis Island in New York. So many people came directly into Florida, including many Jews. Then we have Tampa in 1844, which is still 48 years before South Florida. If you notice, I haven't mentioned South Florida because there was no South Florida yet. We have Ocala in the 1850s, Orlando 1865, right after the Civil War, Palm Beach 1892, and Miami 1892, both a result of Henry Flagler's railroad coming south. On the West Coast, you had Henry Plant's Railroad, and on the East Coast, you had Henry Flagler. Then we have St. Petersburg, where I live, in 1901. Then we have Davie in Broward County, which was the first place that a Jew settled, excuse me, in 1910. Then we have Sarasota and Miami Beach in 1913, Fort Lauderdale 1915, Boca Raton 1931. This was the biggest surprise to me because Boca today hosts the state's largest Jewish community. And then we have Southwest Florida in the 1950s. Why so late? Because Jews were not wanted there. To document and preserve my 40 years of research and collecting the material evidence of the Jewish history in Florida, I wrote a big hardcover book. It's 434 pages with 716 photographs. This first comprehensive history of the Jews of Florida from colonial times to the present is a sweeping tapestry of voices spanning centuries. Jews have been integral to every area of Florida's growth, from tilling the land and developing early communities to boosting tourism and ultimately pushing mankind into space. During my research phase, I had a dynamic team working with me to retrieve Tampa's Jewish history, led by Doris Rosenblatt and Nell Friedman. The Tampa's Jewish history was so rich that I wrote a book on this community that today has about 23,000 Jews. That book has 230 photos, some of which I'm sharing with you today, along with Tampa photos from my big book. These photos demonstrate how Jews helped develop every area of the community and became integral to that community. On the cover of that book is the Rabbi Ralph Hirschon with charter members of Rodef Shalom Ladies Auxiliary in 1917. Tampa had its origin in 1824 when Fort Brooke was erected on the Hillsborough River to keep watch on the Seminole Indians. It was named for the Army colonel in command. From the earliest time, Jewish settlers and merchants came and went from the area as the economic opportunities intermittently opened up and weakened. I tell the story of the Jews of Tampa through 8 chapters. This collage shows family who came to Tampa more than 100 years ago. Family members are still in Tampa. On the top left, we have the Maz family. Then we have the Brash family. Then the David Stein. On the bottom row, we have the Rosenblatt family and the Solomon Hamowitz family. Emmeline Miley settled in Fano Tasasa in 1844, a year before Florida became a state. This is 70 years before there were any Jews on Miami Beach, I want to make mention. It is widely accepted that the first photo in the world dates from 1826. This is a very poor quality, updated photo of Emmeline Miley. At age 18, she married William Miley only after he agreed to sell his slaves. They cleared land, built a log cabin, and planted the area's first orange grove. Emmeline survived the Indians, raised 12 children, and after William's death, expanded the groves herself. She was buried in 1907 in Thonotusasa, where there is a Miley Road named in her honor. In my early days of collecting images around the state, I found many photos of people on alligators, our state animal. This one of Teresa Buxbaum and Martin Seckbach is in 1910 in Plant Park. I always get asked if the alligators are alive, which they are not. They're stuffed. Jewish communal organizations are formed to perpetuate Jewish life, culture, and traditions to help ensure Jewish continuity. The left photo shows the gates from the Jewish cemetery and shows some of the graves poking through you can see through the gates. Historically, Jews first create a cemetery to establish their community. In Tampa, the congregation came first, but after 2 years of appealing to the Tampa City Council, Sher Zedek purchased a 1-acre cemetery plot within the city's Woodlawn Cemetery in 1896. The oldest grave is S. Solomon from 1896. Florida's first Jewish cemetery was in 1857 in Jacksonville. On the right-hand side of this photograph is a page from the minute book from the formation of Congregation Sher Zedek, which means Gates of Righteousness. It's from 1894. Today, the congregation is serving more than 1,000 families. This timeline shows when Tampa Jewish organizations began. I'll let you briefly look through that. A sampling of Jewish organizations. Well, let me just let you look through that real quickly. Here are some photos of a sampling of Jewish organizations. On the left, we have Sher Zedek, that was formed in 1894 with Rabbi David Zelanka with Sher Zedek confirmation class in 1934. The top right is a Tom Thumb wedding, which was used as a fundraiser. You see the children are performing a wedding, and this was in 1936. Tom Thumb weddings were very popular, I noticed, all over Florida as fundraisers for congregations. And then on the bottom right, we have the Congregation Sher Zedek Sunday School from 1935. Here is an ad for a Darrow debate. I'm sure many of you remember the name Charles Darrow. Rabbi David Zelanka served Congregation Sher Zedek. David Zelanka is in the top left inset. He served from 1930 to 1970 and is emeritus until 1977. He and Clarence Darrow, known for defending John Scopes in the monkey trial, joined with other Tampa religious leaders in a Bible debate in 1931. When the University of Tampa opened that year, Rabbi Zelanka served on the faculty, and in 1963, he became head of the religious department at the University of Tampa. Congregation Road of Shalom was founded in 1903 as a breakaway from Congregation Sher Zedek. In the top left, there's a photo of the men's club in 1920. On the right is their Sunday school in 1937. And on the left bottom is the first bat mitzvah at Road of Shalom in 1952. On the left, we have the Young Men's Hebrew Association dedication program in 1924. It was organized in 1906, and the group secured a building at the corner of Ross and Nebraska to centralize Jewish activities. After World War II, it became a JCC, a Jewish Community Center. At the top right is the Jewish Federation that started in 1941, which has many committees. And this is a committee meeting of Super Sunday Cabinet of 1993. And then on the lower right, we have the Tampa Jewish Community Center Cub Scouts in the 1960s. Florida Jewish Weekly this is the first inaugural issue for the first Jewish publication in Tampa. This is volume 1, number 1, 1924. Jewish merchants played a huge role in the development of Tampa's business community. On the left, we have an ad for Max White's store in 1860. Jewish merchants arrived before and after the Civil War. Attracted by the Florida frontier, Max White, Marcus Brent, George Blum, and David Kloppenberg, S. Sternberger, Gustav Lewinson, Edward Bateman, and Isidore Blumenthal were among those who came, some with wives, and opened stores. Polish immigrant Abraham Mordecai Weiss, he anglicized his name to become Max White, arrived from Key West in 1858 to Tampa and was a tailor in his uncle's business. On the right, we have an ad for the Riverside Restaurant and Oyster Saloon. Yes, oysters are not kosher, for those of you that are going to ask. 1870. Arriving on a steamer from New York, Gustav Oppenheimer's restaurant was on Water Street near the Hillsborough River Ferry. In the beginning, I showed you a watch with Hebrew numerals and told you about the Delinsky family, the longest continuing Jewish family in Florida. Philip Delinsky, shown on the left, was the first to settle in Florida in 1850. He was a merchant in Tampa and towns nearby like Madison, Fort Meade, Palatka, and Bartow. He was one of Florida's first real estate agents, an organizer of the Tampa, Peace Creek, and St. John's Railroad, and a politician. In 1877, with others, he created the Tampa and Fort Meade Telegraph Company that helped link Tampa to the outside world. Would you believe that a Jewish person did this? He brought Jewish culture to the frontier and maintained a library of about 1,400 books. When the Delinsky family lived in Fort Meade for 19 years, Philip diversified their livelihood. He became a cotton broker, owner of a drugstore and a livery stable, and one of the state's first citrus shippers. His wife, Mary, ran their hotel. Imagine a businesswoman in 1833. But their personal lives, like most of the pioneers, was one of boom and bust due to hurricanes, citrus freezers, and yellow fever epidemics of the 1880s. Ybor City, founded in 1886, has been transformed from the days when Romanian, Russian, and German Jewish immigrants arrived with their merchandising skills. More than 80 Jewish businesses are listed here in Ybor City. The info came from old city directories, but not always totally accurate. And 1903 is the oldest the library had that I could find. What remains are some storefronts and signs that represent the impact of this group of people on the history of Ybor City. Romanian Isidore Konitz was attracted to Ybor City when it became a center of growth with Henry Plant's South Florida Railroad in 1884. He named his store Sombrero Blanco because it means white hat for all the Cubans there. This was his second store in 1903 and the first brick building in Ybor City. The Maz family is shown here standing in front of the Dry Goods Palace, which was the original name of their store, in 1896. Maz Brothers, as you would hopefully remember it, became a chain of 39 stores throughout Florida and lasted 105 years. This was the first store of Abe Maz that he opened with his wife, Bina, in a 23 by 90 foot room. 23 by 90 feet, in the two-story J.C. Field building at Franklin and Twig Streets, when there were 720 residents in Tampa. Abe Maz is shown on the far right in the circle, leaning against the column, and his cousin Ernest Maz is to his left. This photo reflects the department store name change to Maz Brothers. In 1921, they moved to an 8-story, 25,000 square foot building at Zack and Tampa Streets and went from 3 employees to over 100. The growth of Maz Brothers was fueled by the growth of Tampa, which by 1900 had grown to nearly 16,000 people, due mostly to the railroad, tourism, the cigar industry, and the military. In 1929, Abe and Isaac Maz sold their interests to Hahn department stores, but continued as president and chairman of the board, respectively. In 1935, Isaac died, and Abe continued on with the name that had changed to Allied Stores, but it was still operated by the Maz family. Abe died in 1941. By that time, the population of Tampa had grown to 500,000, and the West Coast was greatly expanding. Maz's first branch was in St. Petersburg in 1948, Lakeland 54, Sarasota 56, Clearwater 61, and then Fort Myers. In 1991, Maz was closed. In 1895, when brothers Fred and Morris Wolf arrived in Tampa from Germany, they were employed with their brothers-in-law, Abe and Isaac Maz, until 1898, when Morris set up his own business with $200, and then Fred joined him. This was a fine men's store that lasted about 100 years in Tampa. Max Argentar was the first in his family to arrive in Tampa. He worked for Isidore Conitz, and then 4 years later, he opened his own store. He married Annie Davis from Key West, and they raised 6 children in Tampa: Sammy, Arnold, Rachel, Lena, Esther, and Florence. This is the second Max Argentar store in 1937. Sammy, who's shown in the picture in the inset, he's on the right, began working full-time in 1937. In 1964, he and his wife Dorothy took over the business until it closed in 2004 after 96 years of continuous family-run operation. The mostly Latin and Black customers remained loyal through urban renewal. Even after closing, the building with the Argentar sign remained in Ybor City. This is an example of a smaller but ubiquitous Jewish-owned business. Joseph Weissman came to Ybor City from Romania in 1913. In 1920, he and his wife, Sylvia Margolis, opened the Red Globe clothing store. After World War I, the name was changed to Weissman's Clothing Store, and it eventually became Martin's Uniforms. Adam Wolfson arrived in Key West in 1888. By 1920, Adam had moved to Tampa with his sons Abraham and William. Adam built a brick structure where he started Wolfson's Trimming Store and Wolfson's Men and Boys Store on 7th Avenue in Ybor City. Wolfson 22 is carved faintly into the top of the building that remains. When Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, ushering in a repressive communist regime, some Cuban Jews settled in Tampa. In the top photo, you see employees of the National Brush Company, which is the forebearer of today's Corona brushes in Tampa. This upper photograph in Cuba is 1954. On the right, you see the Waxman family in Cuba. And then the story of Corona Brushes, Inc. spans thousands of miles and 8 decades. In Russia, Jude Waxman learned the trade of processing hog bristles for paintbrush manufacturing. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Jude left Russia. Immigration quotas prohibited him from coming to America, so he settled with his family in Havana, Cuba. When the Waxman family arrived in Tampa, some of them opened the Corona Brush Factory in Ybor City, and some bought the Dress Mart in downtown Tampa. The bottom photograph shows the Corona Brush Company in Ybor City in 1962. The third generation is running the business today. Tobacco and cigars are a large part of the Florida Jewish story. This is the Ripper Brothers family cigars in 1904 in Tampa. Most Jews in Ybor City were merchants, but some were involved in cigar production. In 1888, due to the persecution of Jews in Romania, the Ripa family became part of a chain migration to Key West. From there, they moved their cigar factory to Ybor City to produce their own brand. Most cigar factories were in Key West in the 1880s, then moved in 1891 to Ybor City. This factory and label belonged to the oldest family-owned cigar maker in the United States and is the last cigar factory in Tampa today that had 150 factories in Ybor City, many owned by Jews. This decline was a result of labor strikes, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the Cuban embargo, taxes, and health issues. J.C. Newman began in Cleveland in 1895 and moved to Ybor City in 1954 to be closer to the primary source of tobacco, which was Cuba. The company, now into the fourth generation, moved into the vacated landmark Regensburg factory that was built in 1910 and is recognized from I-275 by its clock tower. Note the Cuesta Rey cigar label with the Mogen David, which is a symbol of Judaism, around the necklace on the woman. The brand is sold today in 80 countries. Bern and Gert Laxer owned the Beer Haven Bar in Tampa. When they started the steakhouse in 1956, they used letters that they could salvage from their original sign and bought an S to create the name Bern's. They gradually bought adjoining buildings on South Howard Avenue for expansion. The Harry Waugh Dessert Room was built in 1985 using redwood wine casks to create 48 private rooms. Their son David continued the business. In 2013, they opened the Epicurean Hotel in Tampa. Jews were active in other industries in Tampa. One example was Stuart Golding. In 1959, he moved to Tampa and became a leading shopping center developer. His projects include Seminole, Park Plaza, Sunset Square, Gateway, Brandon, Town and Country, 12 Oaks Plaza, and the 1 million square foot Countryside Mall. There is a Stuart S. Golding Endowed Chair of Contemporary Art at the University of South Florida. This morning, like every morning, I read the Washington Post on my phone. From 2013 to 2021, Marty Barron was executive editor. He was born in 1954 in Tampa, where he grew up. His parents had immigrated from Israel and had every news resource available in their home so they could learn about their new country. That's how Marty got interested in media. Barron's role as editor of the Boston Globe was highlighted in the movie Spotlight. He led the 2003 investigation into a cover-up of sexual abuse by priests within the Boston Archdiocese. Newsrooms under his leadership earned 17 Pulitzer Prizes. As we drive around Florida, we come across causeways and bridges named for Jews who have contributed much to the development of the state. These are some examples. A note on the lower right, the Buckman Highway in Hillsborough County, named for Paul S. Buckman. Buckman was an exemplary citizen worthy of the state's 1994 designation of the road from Interstate 4 in Hillsborough County to U.S. Highway 301 in Pasco County. He was educated totally in Florida, served in the U.S. Army, and had a private law practice while serving as Plant City's attorney for 42 years, from 1949 to 1991. I shop at Publix where I buy strawberries that until 2011 had this label with the Jewish symbol of the Mogen David. Polish immigrants Yetta and Harris Wisnowski came from New York to Plant City in 1930. The third generation running the operation today changed the label to Wish. I am asked, why is there a photo of a cruise ship on the cover of my book? They are major economic drivers for our state, contributing more than $8 billion annually. Florida is the nation's #1 cruise state. Today, there are 3 public cruise lines, and all 3 are chaired by Florida Jews. Carolyn Kurtz has brought ships into the port of Tampa for more than 2 decades. From the pilot boat, she snugs up to the immense incoming vessels, jumps to the ship's dangling rope ladder, which you see there on the left, and climbs up 30 feet as shown in the photograph. Then she takes control of the ship, telling the crew how to make it through Tampa's 42-mile channel, the state's longest. Her job is to prevent collisions and groundings. Very exciting for Tampa, sports personality Jeffrey Vinnick began his $3 billion, 52-acre waterfront project in Tampa to be completed in 2027. It will feature 1 million square feet of retail offices, homes, hotels, culture and education centers, and 13 acres of parks and public spaces. Some of the phases are already open. A strong example of a Jew in the professions is Dr. Louis Oppenheimer, who lived from 1854 to 1939. He came to Tampa in 1895. He served as house physician for the Tampa Bay Hotel and performed operations by lamplight on his kitchen table. He did the city's first abdominal operation and invented many surgical procedures and instruments that are used today. His brochure touting Tampa as a health resort is credited as the deciding factor for troop embarkation during the Spanish-American War. Practicing medicine and surgery in Florida for more than 50 years, he was president of the Hillsborough County Medical Society, and his funeral was held on the day of a hurricane, and still more than 2,000 people attended to pay tribute to this humanitarian. You see on the right a letter from Dr. Louis Oppenheimer in 1908, where he expounds on Tampa's climate and its healing qualities like an early chamber of commerce to attract tourists to the West Coast. Some example of Jews in the community are top left, Moses Henry Cohen as Elk's president in 1926. M. Henry Cohen was admitted to the practice of law in 1894. The same year, he became the first secretary of Shares Zedek Congregation, where he served for 28 years. He married Julia Wolfe, whose family owned the Wolfe Brothers store that I showed you. Cohen served in the Spanish-American War, then as a municipal judge and assistant city attorney in Tampa. He was very active in Tampa's civic and fraternal organizations. On the far right is Benna Maz, the wife of Abe Maz. They started Maz Brothers. She was the founder of the Children's Home in 1905. She and Abe were childhood sweethearts in their native Germany. They married in 1883. And as I mentioned earlier, she worked alongside Abe and Maz Brothers until the business stabilized. She was president of the Children's Home for 25 years. She engaged in many other charitable and welfare projects, mostly anonymously, but especially for orphans. She was the last surviving charter member of the Order of the Eastern Star in Tampa. And then in the center, you meet Daisy Guggenheimer Waterman. Around the 1930s. Jerome Waterman's wife, Daisy, led the Tampa chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women in 1935 to establish the Lighthouse for the Blind that was named for her after she died of cancer at age 45. The Lighthouse is a United Way recipient, and its building, erected at 1106 West Platte Street in 1955, still bears Waterman's name. This is a photograph of the Masons Hillsborough Lodge, number 25 in 1928. Many Jews participated in fraternal organizations that displayed their civic responsibility. Freemasonry promotes separation of church and state, where politics can be discussed. Masonry's belief in universal brotherhood and tolerance significantly paved the way for Jews in the community. Members are involved in charities and service activities. This Tampa Tribune photo of the lodge, founded in 1850, includes Henry Brash, Abe Maz, Isaac Maz, among others of Tampa's oldest Masonic lodge. On the left, you meet Jerome Waterman, 1949. A Maz nephew, Waterman arrived in 1907 and went from bookkeeper to chief executive at Maz Brothers. He made lasting contributions to the community, including opening Tampa's early movie theaters. He played a major part in the growth of aviation in Tampa and wrote books and newspaper columns. There's a room in the Officers Club named for him at MacDill Air Force Base. He was one of the first businessmen in Florida to fly. He organized Gulf Airlines, which later merged with National Airlines and became the advisory director at National. On the right, you see Jerome Waterman at age 80 as the Grand Marshal of Gasparilla in 1964. I was surprised to find Jews in Gasparilla that started in 1904, but there were a few. Another Jew involved in Gasparilla is David Falk. He was the Gasparilla King in 1938. Tampa-born David Falk in 1896 joined his father Ophim in the family business, O. Fox Department Store, opened in 1899. David served on the University of Tampa's Board of Trustees from 1948 until his death in 1960. The 1,000-seat Park Theater on Lafayette Street, built in 1928, was named in 1962 as the Falk Theater in his honor. It hosts many of University of Tampa's student productions. On the right, you see a photograph of O. Falk and Brother Dry Goods and Millinery Store around 1900. Ophim and Morris Falk Falk opened this 5-story department store in 1899 at Franklin and Polk Streets. It became the second largest store in Tampa after Ma's. Big news in St. Pete and the statewide arts community is the 26-acre, $92 million St. Pete Pier with a floating net sculpture created by Janet Eckelman. Her work is shown on 5 continents, and this is the first in Florida. Janet is a 4th generation in the pioneer Ripa family who came from Romania to Key West in the 1880s, and then some went to Tampa in 1908, where Janet was later born. Oprah Winfrey named Eckelman on her list at number 1 on the list of 50 things to do that will make you say wow. And she has received many awards for changing the very essence of urban spaces. Judy Genshaft led University of South Florida for 19 years. With campuses in Tampa, St. Petersburg, and Sarasota, Manatee, the USF system serves 50,000 students in 235 degree programs. Dr. Genshaft catapulted the USF system to national and international prominence. Upon her retirement, she gifted $20 million to the school to build a new honors college that will bear her name. This is probably the nation's largest gift by a president back to their university. German immigrant Charles Slager was the first known Jewish politician on the West Coast. Slager and his wife Nina arrived in Tampa in 1870. A merchant, he joined the Masons, accepted appointment as Tampa postmaster, and later served as Hillsborough County sheriff and tax collector, as well as serving on the school board. This is an 1871 letter of resignation from Isidore Blumenthal as Hillsborough County Commissioner. Blumenthal was the first Jewish commissioner on what was then a 5-member board. During his tenure from 1871 to 1873, he worked to improve local conditions and raise the standards for public service. He resigned due to an injury and business challenges, but was persuaded to stay on to enact needed reforms in Tampa. German immigrant Hermann Glogowski settled in Florida in the 1870s and arrived in Tampa in 1884 and opened a clothing store. Glogowski had a talent for people and business and contributed hugely to Tampa's civic and Jewish growth. He served as municipal judge from 1880 to 1886, then was elected mayor. He led Tampa through its transformational and formative periods and enhanced the fiscal stability of the city. Active on the Tampa Board of Trade, he helped develop incentives to bring cigar factories to town. In 1898-99, he was president of Tampa's first Jewish congregation that I mentioned, Sher Zedek. This trowel was used in the groundbreaking for Henry Plant's Tampa Bay Hotel in 1888. Notice Glogowski's engraved name on the trowel. Henry Bradley Plant personally built his palace at a cost of $2,500,000, a lot of money in those days, and an additional $500,000 for furnishings. The first Jewish mayor of more than 200 Jewish mayors in Florida was Henry Brash in the center. Elected in 1879 in Marianna, the German immigrant served 3 terms there and then moved his family to Tampa. This is his family shown in the photograph. Many early Florida mayors were Jewish, as they were respected, trusted, good speakers, and considered highly educated. Sandra Friedman was Tampa's first female mayor and second Jewish mayor. Friedman attacked the escalating crime rate by drugs and hate crimes and increased the police department and number of minorities and women in city government. In 1990, Tampa was designated as the All-American City under her guidance. At the state level, Tampa has had Henry Sandler as a Florida legislator and judge. Sandler arrived in Tampa in 1911 with a law degree. His father, Taylor, had relocated in Ybor City. Sandler served in the Florida legislature from 1932 to 35, was Speaker of the House and sponsor of the Homestead Exemption Amendment. He served on the 13th Judicial Court from 1935 to 64. On the right, it shows Dr. Richard Hodes, on the right picture, is on Air Force One with President Jimmy Carter in 1980. Richard Hose was elected to the Florida House of Representatives in 1966, where he served for 16 years. He gave the nominating speech for Jimmy Carter at the Florida Democratic Convention in 1975. Hose became the first chairman of the University of Florida's anesthesiology department in 1982. Helen Gordon Davis in the inset came to Tampa after World War II and entered politics in 1974 as the first Tampa female elected to state office. She served for 7 terms and then in the Florida Senate in 1988. She is known for her work on social, women's, and family issues and her interest in Florida's justice system. The larger photo here shows Helen Gordon Davis on the far left and Ron Glickman being sworn in to the Florida legislature in 1986. Since 1871, there have been many Jews in county and city politics. These are 2. Linda Salsena on the Tampa City Council, where she served for 20 years, and Harry Cohen is a native of Tampa who was elected to the Tampa City Council in 2011 and re-elected in 2015, and then elected to the Hillsborough County Board of County Commissioners last November, or actually in November 2020, and is currently on the ballot. On the left, you see Cecile Esrick, the first woman elected to Hillsborough School Board. She is the daughter of Jerome and Daisy Waterman, who you met a few minutes ago, and was elected to the school board in 1967 and served 21 years. On the right is Cecile's daughter, Catherine Esrick, and she's been a judge of the Florida's 13th Circuit Court since 1997. Remember the Red Globe store back in the business section? The owner served in World War II in 1917. U.S. Army Private Joseph Weissman was shipped to France under German fire. Then he came home and opened the store. He is just one example among so many Jews from Tampa who served in the military. In communities all over Florida, soldiers were given great hospitality, especially for Jewish holidays. This is a Passover Seder hosted by Congregation Sher Zedek. The warm welcome and warm weather were factors in many soldiers deciding to make Florida and Tampa their home. Bess Rosenblatt was a Red Cross volunteer in 1943. Her 3 sons all served. In the Navy, we had Nathan, in the Air Force, Charles, and in the Army, Frank. In sports, this is the 2013 front page showing that Tampa's all three sports teams, and they're all owned by Jews. Jeffrey Vinnick on the left, chairman of the National Hockey League, Tampa Bay Lightning since 2010. Brian Glazer in the center, who succeeded his father Malcolm, who purchased the NFL Bucks football team in 1995, and Stuart Sternberg on the right, principal owner of the Major League Baseball Tampa Bay Rays since 2005. All 3 teams have earned national status, and the Bucks, as you know, won the Super Bowl twice in 2003 and 2011. A lesser-known story is Boris Belenko. Before there were major league sports teams in Florida, there was wrestling in the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory that is now the Glazer Family JCC in Tampa. Weekly matches at the Armory attracted sold-out crowds, and one of the top attractions was Russian Jewish immigrant Lawrence Simon, who was billed as Morris the Great Malenko. Don't you love it? After his retirement...
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we are going to have to get to our Q&A session so that we have time for it, because we have another session that's starting up right after this one. So unfortunately, we won't be able to go over. So I'm going to pull our regular presentation screen back up here. All right. And Sarah, if you're still on, we can pop you back on the screen as well. Here we go. All right, so we want to make sure that you're able to follow up on some of these great stories that Marcia is telling you about, and we've got her book up on the screen. Sarah, where can the folks at home get this book?
At our library website, if you go to hcplc.org, and you'll see all the libraries that have copies of her book, and you'd be able to go to that branch if you wanted to put it on hold, or if you wanted to, and also just be able to just go to that branch and then be able to check it out. You can do that. And there are lots of other resources that are also available about genealogy in our collection that we have at the John F. Germany Library here that you're able to look at, as well as other e-resources that are also in our catalog, and other genealogy books and books about local history that you can check out as well.
That's awesome. I'm going to pull up this screen here in the background. We've already had some folks typing in their questions for her, and one of them asked if there was an email address where they could contact you. So happily, we've already got that slide up and ready. So for the folks who are asking for her contact information, we've got the email address on the screen. It's mzerivitz@me.com. So write that down. We'll have that up in the background for a little bit, and I'll go through and start reading out some of our audience questions. So we have one person here that is looks to be doing some research for their family tree, and they said they had a grandfather who had a store on North Franklin, and he came with a group of other Jewish men from some town in Romania, but isn't sure what town it is. And he was wondering if you could point him in the right direction where he might start researching where exactly in Romania that family came from.
I found that most of the families that came into Key West and then migrated up to Tampa came from Hush, Hush, Romania, in the 1880s and 90s.
That's probably going to be a really good starting place then.
Great.
Perfect. All right. Let's see. We have someone that asks, given the admirable history of Jewish contributions to Tampa, Florida, how would you summarize the Jewish culture within the community? What does the history discussed today teach us about the Jewish culture at large?
Well, I think that the biggest lesson, and we all hopefully know this, is that Florida, as I said earlier, is a hugely diverse state. And we're all immigrants. I think a lot of people tend to forget that every one of us in America and in Florida has an immigrant background. I once gave a lecture in the early days of my project at the University of Florida to the history professors, and I said everybody but the Native Americans came from somewhere else, and a professor stopped me and said, Marcia, you can say everyone, because even the Native Americans are not native. They came from Russia, across the Siberian Straits, across to Alaska, and down through the continent. So everyone in Florida has immigrant background. And I think that's what we can learn most about our culture, that we each brought our traditions and our sensibilities as far as religion or culture, and we've blended to bring about what we have today, a melting pot. And I use the word melting pot in the sense that, yes, we have come together, but we each hold on to our own traditions.
And it looks like we have time for one more question. So our last question is going to be, how many years did it take for you to research for your books?
40, about 40 years.
That is not an insignificant sum of time. So thank you so much for answering these audience questions, and thank you for the audience for chiming in along the way. Great questions. Always love to get a little bit more in depth and be able to talk to our experts while they're on screen with us. So thank you to all of our attendees for that, and thank you, Sarah, for hosting and coordinating this program, and thank you so much, Marcia, for sharing all this information with you. I learned some stuff about the very street that I live on from this program today. So that was very interesting. I love that. If the folks at home have any follow-up questions on this program, you want to know more about this program or other genealogical resources that we might have available, you can reach us at hcplc.org/contact. That has all of our contact information on there, including our wonderful Ask a Librarian function, where folks can chat or text with one of our local Hillsborough County librarians. We also have the Florida History and Genealogy Library in our downtown location, and they will happily help you with that research, those research questions. It's lib-fhgl@hillsboroughcounty.org. So you can reach our great genealogy team there for guidance on where to get started and what to do next. And as always, check out our upcoming schedule of events, hcplc.org/events. And we hope you'll be able to join us for our next session starting at 3 p.m. With some more great local history, the amazing Richard Dobby and the history of Dobbyville. So we hope you can join us for that session starting shortly. And thank you all for attending and your questions. Thanks, everyone.